When the Red Army began pushing west in 1943, Soviet propaganda presented it as a march of liberation. Cities were freed. Flags were raised. Victories were announced over radio waves from Moscow to London. But behind the armored columns and infantry divisions moved another force, one that did not fight the Germans directly, yet shaped the outcome of the war just as decisively. It did not answer to battlefield commanders. It did not report casualties. And it did not stop when the fighting ended. This force was the NKVD. Officially, the NKVD was a security service. In practice, it was Stalin's personal instrument of control. It had already devoured the Soviet Union once before, during the Great Purge of the 1930s, when hundreds of thousands were executed and millions sent to labor camps. Entire officer corps were erased. Political loyalty became a matter of life and death. Stalin never forgot that lesson. Military success meant nothing if political control followed slowly. Armies could win wars. Only terror could secure peace. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the NKVD had already been reorganized for wartime expansion. Its internal troops were militarized. Its archives were hardened. Its authority was widened. The war was not seen merely as a struggle against Hitler, but as an opportunity to reshape Europe permanently. When Soviet forces went on the offensive after Stalingrad and Kursk, NKVD operational planning accelerated. New departments were created specifically for liberated territories. Personnel were reassigned from internal repression to external occupation. Training manuals were rewritten. Arrest protocols standardized. Transport coordination with the Railway Ministry refined. This was not improvisation. It was preparation. NKVD units were embedded directly behind advancing fronts, sometimes only kilometers behind, sometimes entering towns within hours of German withdrawal. They arrived with sealed envelopes, arrest lists, and authority that overrode local military command. Red Army officers were instructed not to interfere. In many cases, they were not even informed. The NKVD's mission was simple in wording and absolute in execution. Eliminate any force that could challenge Soviet control after the war. This did not mean Nazis. Those were expected enemies. The real targets were far more dangerous. Independent nationalists, resistance leaders loyal to governments in exile, religious authorities, intellectuals, landowners, non-communist officers, and anyone with local legitimacy outside Moscow's influence. Entire categories of people were labeled before a single investigation took place. Polish officers loyal to London were marked as hostile. Baltic nationalists were pre-classified as bandits. Ukrainian resistance fighters were defined as traitors regardless of whom they had fought. Clergy were flagged as ideological threats. In NKVD logic, guilt was political, not criminal. Arrests followed a pattern that repeated across Eastern Europe. NKVD officers would arrive under the cover of security coordination. Meetings were proposed. Registrations were requested. Weapons were to be surrendered temporarily. Cooperation was encouraged. Compliance was rewarded with survival, at least briefly. Then came the second phase. Leaders were isolated. Communication lines were severed. Units were disarmed piecemeal. Night arrests began quietly. Those taken were rarely charged. Many were never recorded at all. They vanished into transit prisons, interrogation centers, and sealed rail cars moving east. Some were interrogated in Lubyanka. Some were sent directly to camps. Some were executed without paperwork. Families were not informed. Villages were not told. Entire communities were left guessing, which was precisely the point. Fear was more effective than explanation. The NKVD understood something that conventional armies did not. Resistance collapses fastest when people no longer know who is safe, who is next, or why arrests are happening. Randomness created paralysis. Silence destroyed solidarity. What made this Second Army so effective was timing. The NKVD moved before political settlements, before elections, before Western diplomats arrived, before post-war narratives hardened. By the time agreements were signed and borders discussed, the ground reality had already been altered. Opposition leadership was gone. Networks were dismantled. Societies were conditioned. To the outside world, Eastern Europe appeared liberated. On the inside, it was being pre-cleared for Soviet rule. Western Allied intelligence received fragments of this picture, reports of arrests, rumors of deportations, intercepted communications. But these details were drowned out by battlefield urgency and alliance politics. Stalin was still needed. Confrontation could wait. The NKVD did not wait. By early 1945, this hidden war had spread from Poland to the Baltics, from Ukraine to Romania, Hungary, and beyond. Each region required different methods, but the objective never changed. Control first, legitimacy later. World War II is often remembered as a clash between armies and ideologies. What is less remembered is that for millions of people, the decisive battle did not involve tanks or bombers. It involved a knock at the door after midnight, a name on a list, and a train heading east. This was the war behind the war, and it had only just begun. Before we go further, understand this clearly. None of what follows was accidental. It was planned, documented, and deliberately erased. If you want the classified side of World War II, the stories removed from textbooks and victory speeches, subscribe to Declassified. Now, let's move to Poland, where cooperation with the Red Army became a carefully laid trap. When the Red Army crossed into Poland in 1944, it entered a country that had never stopped fighting. For 5 years, Poland had lived underground. A secret state existed beneath German occupation, complete with courts, schools, intelligence networks, and an army loyal not to Moscow, but to a government in exile in London. That army was the Polish Home Army, known as the AK. To Britain and the United States, the AK was an ally. It provided intelligence, sabotaged German supply lines, and coordinated with Allied strategy. To Stalin, it was something far more dangerous than a German division. It represented an independent Poland. Stalin had not forgotten 1920, when a newly independent Polish state had stopped the Red Army outside Warsaw. He did not intend to let history repeat itself. Poland would be liberated, but not allowed to choose its own future. The NKVD was tasked with ensuring that outcome. At first, the approach was careful. NKVD officers made contact with Polish resistance commanders under the language of cooperation. They spoke of unity against the Germans. They promised recognition. They offered joint operations. Many Polish leaders, desperate to save their country and preserve their forces for the post-war period, chose to engage. What they did not realize was that they were already condemned. As the Red Army approached Warsaw in the summer of 1944, the Polish underground made a fateful decision. Believing Soviet forces would support them, the Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. For 63 days, Polish fighters held out against German armor and air power, expecting relief from across the Vistula River. It never came. Soviet forces halted their advance. NKVD units watched. Supplies were denied. Radio coordination was blocked. As Warsaw burned, the Red Army remained stationary, allowing the Germans to crush the uprising completely. Over 200,000 civilians died. The Home Army's strongest urban base was annihilated. This was not military hesitation. It was political calculation. The destruction of Warsaw removed the largest organized non-communist force in Poland without the Soviets firing a shot. When the city finally fell, the NKVD moved in, not to rebuild, but to identify survivors. In the months that followed, NKVD units intensified their campaign. Home Army officers were summoned for registration. Safe passage was promised. Weapons were to be turned in temporarily. Those who complied were arrested. Those who refused were hunted as bandits. The most devastating blow came in March 1945. 16 leaders of the Polish underground state were invited to a meeting with Soviet authorities to discuss post-war cooperation. The invitation was formal. Guarantees of safety were given. Transportation was arranged by the NKVD itself. The meeting was a trap. All 16 men were arrested on arrival and flown to Moscow. There, in the cellars of Lubyanka, they were interrogated, beaten, and psychologically broken. Their crime was not collaboration with Germany. It was loyalty to a Polish state that existed outside Soviet control. The subsequent trial of the 16 was a performance staged for international audiences. Confessions were coerced. Charges were fabricated. Sentences were predetermined. Some defendants died shortly after release. Others disappeared into the Gulag. By the time Western governments protested, it was too late. Poland's legitimate leadership had been removed. The message was clear to anyone still resisting. The NKVD did not need to arrest every Home Army fighter. It only needed to destroy trust. Resistance units fractured. Informants multiplied. Fear replaced coordination. Thousands fled west. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. Elections followed, but only after opposition parties had been gutted. Security services were Soviet-trained. Ballot boxes were monitored. Outcomes were decided before votes were cast. Poland did not fall to communism through revolution. It was neutralized through deception, timing, and terror, under the cover of Allied victory. What happened in Poland became the blueprint. For Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the return of the Red Army in 1944 did not feel like liberation. It felt like repetition. These countries had already lived through Soviet occupation once before. In 1940, they had been annexed, purged, and terrorized. Tens of thousands were arrested. Political leaders vanished. Families were deported east in sealed cattle cars. When the Germans invaded in 1941, many Baltics did not greet them as saviors, but as a temporary escape from something worse. By the time Soviet forces returned 3 years later, the population understood exactly what Soviet rule meant. This time, they were ready. Across forests and rural regions, thousands of men and women disappeared underground. They formed armed resistance units that would later be known collectively as the Forest Brothers. These were not scattered outlaws. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply embedded in local society. Many were former soldiers. Others were students, farmers, or civil servants who refused to accept permanent occupation. Their objective was simple: survival until the West intervened. They believed another war was coming, that Britain and the United States would not abandon Eastern Europe. That time was on their side. The NKVD moved to make sure that belief died quickly. Unlike in Poland, where deception was sufficient, the Baltics required direct repression. NKVD commanders recognized that killing fighters alone would not end resistance. As long as villages provided food, shelter, and information, the Forest Brothers could continue indefinitely. So, the NKVD targeted the population itself. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were classified as hostile zones. Curfews were imposed. Searches became routine. Anyone caught with food beyond ration limits risked arrest. Informants were recruited under threat. Fear seeped into daily life. Then came the deportations. NKVD planning documents described them as resettlement operations. In practice, they were mass removals carried out with military precision. Lists were compiled months in advance. Trains were scheduled. Units were briefed down to the hour. Before dawn, NKVD troops surrounded entire villages. Families were given minutes to gather belongings. No charges were read. No explanations offered. Children, elderly parents, pregnant women, everyone was taken. They were loaded onto trucks, then onto trains. Cattle cars sealed from the outside. Journeys lasted weeks. Food was minimal, water scarce. Many died before reaching their destination. Those who survived were dumped into remote regions of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic. They were not prisoners in the legal sense. They were special settlers, stripped of rights, forced into labor, and forbidden from leaving. The most infamous of these actions came in March 1949, during Operation Praboy. In just 3 days, nearly 90,000 people were deported from the Baltic States. Entire rural districts were emptied. Resistance support networks collapsed overnight. This was not counterinsurgency. It was demographic warfare. Captured Forest Brothers were exploited ruthlessly. Some were tortured into cooperation. Others were forced to write letters urging surrender. Executions were carried out publicly. Bodies were displayed as warnings. The goal was visibility. The NKVD wanted everyone to understand the cost of resistance. Western awareness was minimal. The Baltics were considered internal Soviet territory by this point. Refugee testimonies were dismissed as exaggerations. Journalists had no access. Diplomats had no leverage. By the early 1950s, armed resistance was largely broken, not because the Forest Brothers were defeated in battle, but because the societies that sustained them had been dismantled. Villages were gone. Families were scattered. Silence replaced defiance. For the Soviet Union, the Baltic operation was a success. Independence was erased. Memory was suppressed. A generation grew up knowing only one truth. What the NKVD proved in the Baltics was chillingly simple. Resistance does not need to be defeated. It only needs to be isolated. In Ukraine, the NKVD did not inherit a defeated society. It inherited a battlefield that never stopped burning. Unlike Poland or the Baltics, Western Ukraine entered the final years of World War II already fractured by multiple occupations, shifting alliances, famine, and terror. Soviet rule before 1941 had left scars that never healed. German occupation added new atrocities. When the Red Army returned in 1944, it did not arrive as a liberator. It arrived as the latest force in a war that had already devoured millions. Here, resistance was not symbolic. It was armed, organized, and prepared to fight indefinitely. At the center of that resistance stood the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. The UPA was born from a brutal reality. Ukrainian nationalists believed that survival required independence from both Berlin and Moscow. Throughout the war, elements of the movement fought Germans, Soviets, and rival factions at different times. This ambiguity later became the NKVD's greatest propaganda weapon. To Moscow, none of that nuance mattered. Ukrainian nationalism itself was the crime. Stalin viewed Ukraine not merely as territory, but as a pillar of the Soviet system. Its agriculture fed the state. Its industry powered the war. Its population was too large, too conscious, and too historically independent to be allowed autonomy. Any nationalist movement, regardless of ideology, represented an existential threat. The NKVD was ordered to destroy it completely. What followed was not a campaign. It was a war within the war. NKVD internal troops flooded western Ukraine in numbers rivaling frontline formations. Entire districts were placed under security administration. Villages were searched repeatedly, sometimes weekly. Roads were controlled. Travel required permits. Night curfews were enforced with lethal force. But even this was not enough. The UPA did not operate like a conventional army. It dissolved into forests, mountains, and villages. Fighters blended back into civilian life. Networks were local, familial, and resilient. Killing one unit changed nothing. So the NKVD escalated. One of the most devastating tools used in Ukraine was false flag warfare. NKVD special units dressed as UPA fighters. They used captured weapons, spoke local dialects, and staged attacks on civilians. Entire villages were burned. Executions were carried out publicly. Survivors were told that this was the future promised by nationalism. The effect was corrosive. Trust collapsed. Civilians no longer knew who was real resistance and who was Soviet deception. Fear replaced loyalty. Information dried up. At the same time, interrogation practices intensified. Captured suspects were not treated as prisoners of war. They were processed as internal enemies. NKVD files describe accelerated methods designed to break resistance quickly. Sleep deprivation, beatings, threats against family members, staged executions. Confessions were extracted, not for justice, but for mapping entire networks. Once a name was given, that family was marked. Deportation became the next phase. Families of suspected insurgents were labeled socially dangerous elements. This classification required no trial. Entire households were removed regardless of age or involvement. Children were deported alongside parents. The elderly were not exempt. Between 1944 and 1947 alone, hundreds of thousands were deported from western Ukraine to Siberia and Central Asia. Villages were hollowed out. Regions were depopulated. Resistance zones were turned into controlled wastelands. Still, the fighting continued. UPA units adapted. They avoided large engagements. They relied on small cells. Some fighters remained underground for years, emerging only at night. By the late 1940s, Ukraine had become a low-intensity war zone hidden behind the Iron Curtain. World War II had ended, but people were still being killed. Soviet casualty reports quietly acknowledged the scale of the conflict. Thousands of NKVD and internal troops were killed or wounded. Tens of thousands of suspected insurgents were executed or died in custody. The real numbers remain unknown. By the early 1950s, the resistance was finally exhausted, not defeated in battle, but crushed under the weight of terror, deportation, and demographic destruction. What survived was silence. Ukraine paid the highest price for Stalin's post-war security doctrine. It demonstrated how far the Soviet state was willing to go to erase national identity, and how long it was willing to fight its own population to do it. And then, once the model was perfected, it was exported. By 1945, the NKVD no longer needed mass terror everywhere. Poland had shown how leadership decapitation worked. The Baltics proved deportation could erase resistance. Ukraine demonstrated how long terror could be sustained when necessary. Central Europe required something different. Romania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were not conquered through prolonged fighting after the war. They were converted methodically, legally, and quietly into communist states under the supervision of Soviet security organs. This process did not rely on tanks in the streets. It relied on fear already established elsewhere. The NKVD arrived not as an occupying force, but as advisors. They embedded themselves inside emerging security services, interior ministries, and intelligence departments. Officially, these were sovereign governments. In reality, their most powerful institutions were trained, monitored, and directed by Moscow. The first priority was control of information. New security services were created rapidly, staffed by local communists vetted by Soviet intelligence. These services inherited NKVD methods wholesale: surveillance files, informant recruitment, interrogation techniques. The goal was not mass arrests at first. It was knowledge. Every politician, officer, judge, journalist, and union leader was catalogued. Files became weapons. In Romania, King Michael remained on the throne after the war, giving the illusion of continuity. But behind him, the security apparatus shifted completely. NKVD advisors trained the newly formed Securitate, which began assembling dossiers on non-communist politicians almost immediately. Opposition leaders were not arrested all at once. They were isolated. Accusations of fascist collaboration surfaced selectively. Arrests happened quietly, often justified as anti-Nazi purges. Newspapers echoed the charges. Courts followed instructions. By the time the monarchy was abolished in 1947, resistance had already been neutralized. In Hungary, the process became infamous under a single phrase: Salami tactics. Communist leader Matyas Rákosi later admitted openly that opposition was destroyed slice by slice. Each party was divided, each faction accused, each leader compromised or removed. The NKVD did not need to arrest thousands. It needed only to decide who went first. Security services arrested selected politicians under charges of espionage or conspiracy. Others were blackmailed with compromat provided by Soviet intelligence. Fear did the rest. Parties collapsed from within. Elections still happened. Coalitions still formed. But outcomes were engineered long before ballots were cast. In Czechoslovakia, the NKVD executed its most elegant operation. Czechoslovakia had a strong democratic tradition and broad public support for socialism after the war. This made open repression unnecessary at first. Instead, communists were placed strategically inside police and intelligence agencies with NKVD guidance by the EA. Time of the 1948 coup, the security forces were already loyal. When communist leaders demanded emergency powers, no resistance materialized. Non-communist ministers resigned in protest, expecting public backlash. It never came. Everyone understood what refusal meant. The coup unfolded with minimal violence, not because opposition agreed, but because the threat of NKVD-style repression was already understood across Europe. Poland, the Baltics, and Ukraine had sent a message without needing to speak. The NKVD's greatest success was psychological. People did not need to see deportations to believe in them. They had heard the stories. They had seen refugees. They had read the names that vanished. Cooperation became survival. Western diplomats misread this transformation completely. They saw constitutional processes. They saw elections. They saw coalition governments. What they did not see were the interrogation rooms, the files, the informant networks, and the quiet arrests that preceded every political shift. By the time communist governments formally aligned with Moscow, the question was no longer whether resistance existed, but whether it was even imaginable. The NKVD had proven that you could conquer a country without invading it, as long as you controlled fear, institutions, and time. By 1949, Eastern Europe was sealed. Borders hardened, travel was restricted, information vanished. What had begun as a wartime security operation had become a permanent system, and only then did the West fully understand what had happened. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending, but another conflict was already underway. It had no front lines, no declarations, and no clear beginning. It unfolded quietly, behind conference doors, classified cables, and carefully chosen silences. The Western Allies did not enter this phase blind. They entered it conflicted. British and American intelligence agencies were receiving reports long before the war ended. Polish underground couriers reached London with detailed accounts of arrests and disappearances. Baltic refugees crossed into Western zones with identical stories of deportations and sealed trains. Signals intelligence intercepted communications, referencing mass population transfers east. The pattern was visible. What was missing was action. Inside the British Foreign Office and the American State Department, internal memoranda warned that Eastern Europe was being reshaped through intimidation rather than consent. Some officials explicitly stated that free elections promised by Stalin were already impossible. Others argued that confrontation would fracture the alliance before Japan was defeated. The decision was made repeatedly, quietly, and deliberately. Wait. At Yalta, declarations were signed, guaranteeing democratic governments across Europe. At the same moment, opposition leaders in Poland sat in NKVD prisons. At Potsdam, borders were discussed while deportation trains continued running east. The agreements looked balanced on paper. On the ground, the outcome was already settled. Western leaders told themselves that influence could be exerted later, that diplomacy would correct excesses, that economic pressure might soften Soviet behavior, that cooperation had to be preserved at any cost. Stalin understood this perfectly. He knew the West would not intervene militarily in Eastern Europe. He knew war weariness ran deep. He knew public opinion would not tolerate another conflict. The NKVD's campaign accelerated precisely because resistance was unlikely. By 1946, the illusion collapsed. Reports from Eastern Europe became impossible to ignore. Communist takeovers were no longer subtle. Borders closed. Opposition parties vanished. Churches were targeted. Press freedoms disappeared. Refugee flows increased. Intelligence assessments hardened. It was too late. The systems the NKVD had built could not be dismantled from the outside. Security services controlled populations internally. Informant networks penetrated every institution. Fear had become self-sustaining. When Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, he was not announcing a new reality. He was acknowledging one that had already been constructed. The Cold War did not begin with speeches or doctrines. It began with arrests, deportations, and silence. Millions of people disappeared behind a boundary that no army crossed. For them, the war never truly ended. It simply changed language. The uniforms were different. The slogans were new. The repression felt familiar. What makes the NKVD's hidden war so consequential is not just its brutality, but its success. It proved that modern states could be conquered without invasion, societies broken without mass battles, and futures rewritten before peace treaties were signed. The post-war world was shaped not only by those who fought openly, but by those who operated in shadows while others looked away. History remembers victory days. It remembers surrender documents. It remembers conferences and speeches. What it often forgets are the nights after liberation, when doors were knocked on, names were read aloud, and trains moved east without return. That was the war behind the war, and it shaped the world we still live in. If this episode changed how you see the end of World War II, make sure you're subscribed to WW2 Declassified. Here, we uncover the stories buried beneath victory speeches, classified operations, erased victims, and the shadow wars that shape the modern world. New episodes are coming. Some were never meant to be known. Subscribe now and step into the classified side of history